In January 1979, in Holt County, Nebraska, 17-year-old Sarah Whitlock walked into a scrapyard and asked for something nobody else wanted. Rusted tractor parts. Not one particular part, either. She wanted bent pulleys, cracked gears, broken PTO shafts, worn sprockets, pieces of old cultivators, and anything else the owner was willing to sell by the pound. The scrap dealer stared at her over the counter. "You fixing a tractor?" Sarah shook her head. "Then what in heaven's name are you building?" She looked toward the snow beginning to fall beyond the window. "I don't know yet." The dealer laughed. So did the two farmers standing behind her. Sarah paid $11.40 for nearly 300 pounds of rust. 3 weeks later, those same farmers would remember the sound of that laughter very differently. At the time, Sarah had bigger problems than being mocked. Her father had died the previous spring. Her mother had moved to Omaha for work, leaving Sarah with the family farm because selling it would have meant losing the land her grandfather had spent 40 years improving. The farm wasn't large. 240 acres of corn stubble, winter wheat, pasture, and an old shelter belt surrounded a weather-beaten farmhouse. There was also a red 1952 Farmel M sitting beside the machine shed. The tractor belonged to Sarah's grandfather. Its paint had faded to a dull color that looked brown from a distance. The rear tires were patched. The hydraulic system leaked. The starter sometimes required a hammer. But the engine still turned. Sarah treated that tractor differently from every other machine on the property. She checked its oil every morning. She drained water from the fuel bowl. She kept a coffee can of bolts beside the driver's seat. And when something broke, she repaired it instead of replacing it. That winter, repairing things had become a necessity. The bank wanted $8,700 before spring. The roof over the machine shed needed replacing. The livestock water line froze twice during December. And Sarah had only enough feed to carry the cattle through another month if the weather stayed mild. It didn't. On January 9th, the radio warned that a powerful winter storm was developing across the Central Plains. By evening, the wind had changed. Sarah stood beside the barn door and watched loose snow slide across the yard like smoke. Her neighbor, Earl Jensen, drove over in his pickup the next morning. Earl was 58, broad-shouldered, permanently dusty, and convinced that every farm problem could be solved by buying newer equipment. He looked at the pile of rust beside Sarah's shed. "What are those parts? For what?" "A machine." Earl laughed. "You already have a machine." Sarah looked toward the Farmel M. "This one doesn't work in deep snow." Earl glanced at the tractor. "Neither does whatever you're building." Sarah didn't answer. That was one thing Earl disliked about her. She didn't argue. She simply kept working. For 3 days, Sarah measured, cut, drilled, and welded. The strange machine began to take shape beside the shed. It had no proper plans. Its frame came from an old cultivator. Its drive shaft had belonged to a dead Farmel H. A heavy steel pulley came from a threshing machine. 2 gears came from an abandoned manure spreader. The largest piece was a curved steel housing Sarah had salvaged from an old road maintenance machine. Nobody could understand what she was doing. Not even Earl. On January 11th, the county road supervisor stopped by. His name was Walter Crane. He was 61 and had spent most of his life maintaining roads across Holt County. He looked at Sarah's machine for almost a minute. Then he shook his head. "You trying to build a snowblower?" Sarah tightened a bolt. "Something like that. That thing will tear the tractor apart." Sarah looked at the drive connection. "Only if I let it." Walter frowned. "You've got no shear protection." "I know." "You've got no proper gearbox." "I know." "You don't even have a chute." Sarah pointed toward the barn. "I have one." Walter followed her finger. An old galvanized grain chute rested against the wall. He stared at it. Then he looked back at Sarah. "You're serious?" Sarah nodded. Walter sighed. "Girl, there's a storm coming that won't care how clever you are." Sarah looked toward the horizon. "I know." That afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply. By sunset, the sky had disappeared. There was only white. The radio described the approaching storm as one of the most dangerous winter systems Nebraska had seen in years. Schools began closing. Road crews prepared snowplows. Neighbors checked generators. Sarah did something nobody expected. She rolled the Farmel M into the shed. Then she connected the strange machine. The rusted parts clanged against one another. The belts trembled. The old tractor coughed. And then the machine turned. Slowly. Sarah watched the rotating shaft. She didn't smile. She simply reached for another wrench. Because something was wrong. The machine was turning in the wrong direction. And the blizzard was already coming. By midnight, the wind had become violent. Snow struck the farmhouse windows so hard that Sarah could hear it through the walls. The cattle had been moved into the lower barn. Water buckets were frozen around the edges. The radio kept warning people to stay off the roads. Sarah sat beside the kitchen stove wearing 2 coats and wool gloves. On the table lay her grandfather's notebook. Most of the pages were faded. Some contained tractor measurements. Others contained weather observations. One page had a drawing of the old Farmel M's PTO system. Sarah studied it again. Then she noticed something she had missed. Her grandfather had written 3 words beneath the drawing. Slow torque, not speed. Sarah stared at the sentence. She stood. The strange machine outside suddenly made sense. She wasn't building a conventional snowblower. She was building a low-speed snow-moving system that could use the Farmel's PTO torque without forcing the tractor to spin a modern blower too quickly. The old Farmel wasn't powerful, but it was stubborn. That mattered. Modern equipment moved snow quickly. Her machine would move it slowly. The difference sounded insignificant. It wasn't. Sarah put on her boots. Outside, the wind nearly knocked her sideways. Snow had already reached her knees. She reached the machine shed and opened the door. The machine stood beneath a hanging worklight. Rusty. Ugly. Improvised. But suddenly understandable. Sarah spent the next hour changing the pulley ratio. She replaced one belt. Moved another. Added a chain guard. Then she returned to the Farmel. The tractor started on the 3rd attempt. Its engine shook the shed. Sarah engaged the PTO. The machine groaned. The belt tightened. The gears began turning. Then the auger moved. Snow shot from the housing. Sarah stepped backward. For the first time, she smiled. But the test lasted only 20 seconds. A bolt snapped. The machine stopped. Sarah stared at the broken bolt. Then she heard something outside. A deep cracking sound. The roof of the equipment shed had begun to sag. The weight of the snow was crushing it. Sarah killed the tractor. She ran outside. The roof groaned again. Her grandfather's old Farmel was underneath it. Sarah had minutes. She climbed into the tractor. The engine turned. Nothing happened. The rear wheels spun. The snow was already above the axles. Sarah shifted into low gear. The tractor crawled forward. Then stopped. She backed up. Tried again. Nothing. She climbed down and looked beneath the wheels. The problem wasn't traction. The snow was packed beneath the frame. The tractor couldn't lift itself over the drift. Sarah remembered the machine. The strange machine could move snow, but it wasn't attached to the tractor yet. She ran back to the shed. The wind screamed around her. She dragged the machine through the snow. It was heavier than she remembered. She nearly dropped it twice. Then she saw something. The old steel housing had a curved lower edge. Sarah realized why her grandfather had once kept it. It wasn't part of a snowblower. It was part of a road grader attachment. Its shape could lift packed snow. Sarah stared at it. Then she laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because she finally understood. The machine wasn't supposed to throw the snow. It was supposed to break it first. Sarah connected the attachment to the Farmel. The PTO shaft clicked into place. She climbed into the seat. The engine roared. The auger began turning. The front housing bit into the drift. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the packed snow cracked. The machine pulled itself forward. Sarah gripped the steering wheel. The farmel moved. 1 foot. Then another. Then 10. A wall of snow rolled away from the tractor. Sarah had built a machine that could clear the exact kind of snow that was trapping it. But outside the shed, the storm was getting worse. The wind was pushing snow back faster than she could move it. Sarah looked toward the cattle barn. The path was already disappearing. She needed to clear a route before morning. Earl Jensen had called earlier and warned her not to attempt it. "Stay inside," he'd said. "County crews will get there when they can." Sarah knew they wouldn't. The road to her farm was already closed. The cattle couldn't wait for the county. Sarah climbed back onto the farmel. She turned the lights toward the barn. Then she noticed something moving through the white darkness. A pickup. Someone was walking beside it. Sarah couldn't see the face, only the shape. Someone had come to the farm, and whoever it was had chosen the worst possible night. The figure reached the machine shed just before Sarah shut the door. It was Earl. His beard was covered with ice. His coat was stiff with frozen snow. He could barely speak. "Road's gone." Sarah nodded. "How bad?" Earl looked toward the barn. "Worse than anything I've seen." Then he noticed the machine. For once, he didn't laugh. "What is that?" Sarah pulled off one glove. "Your answer." Earl stared at her. "My answer." Sarah pointed toward the barn. "The cattle water line runs under the east lane." Earl understood immediately. If the lane disappeared, they couldn't reach the buried valve. If the valve froze, the cattle would have no reliable water. The backup pump was on the other side of the property. The only route there crossed a low section that would drift shut first. Earl looked at the machine. "How far can it clear?" Sarah didn't know. That was the problem. She had tested it for 20 seconds. Now she needed it to work for miles. The wind shook the shed. Earl looked at her. "Your father would have waited until morning." Sarah looked at the farmel. "My grandfather wouldn't have." Earl said nothing. They started the tractor. The machine groaned. The auger bit into the snow. And slowly, impossibly, a path appeared. The machine didn't make the snow disappear. It pushed it into long banks along both sides. That became its greatest advantage. Because the banks hardened in the wind, the cleared path became a trench. Once the trench formed, the machine could keep reopening it. Sarah drove for nearly an hour. Earl walked behind her carrying a shovel. At every turn, he expected the machine to fail. It didn't. Then the PTO began vibrating. Sarah immediately stopped. Earl climbed onto the hood. "What?" Sarah listened. The vibration was uneven. She shut the tractor down. The wind screamed. Sarah crawled beneath the machine. One of the salvaged gears had shifted. The worn teeth were beginning to slip. Earl looked at the gear. "That's finished." Sarah shook her head. "No." She opened her grandfather's notebook. The page beneath the PTO drawing contained another note. "Old teeth hold if pressure stays straight." Sarah looked at the gear. Then at the frame. The machine wasn't failing because the gear was worn. The frame was twisting. She needed to reinforce it. They had no proper steel. Earl looked around the shed. Then he pointed toward the old grain elevator. "Those braces." Sarah looked. The elevator had been abandoned since the 1950s. Its steel support brackets were rusted almost through. Sarah hesitated. "They'll hold." Earl smiled. "You've got your grandfather in you." They removed 2 brackets. Sarah bolted them across the frame. Then they started again. This time the machine ran smoother. The technical principle was simple. A PTO transfers rotational power from the tractor engine to an attachment. But power isn't just speed. It is also torque, the twisting force that allows a machine to keep turning when resistance increases. Sarah's Farmel M could not compete with modern tractors for horsepower, but its low gearing gave it enormous usable torque at slow speeds. By changing the pulley ratio and using a heavy reduction system, Sarah had transformed that weakness into strength. The machine moved slowly, but it refused to stop. That mattered in deep snow. Fast machines could bury themselves. Sarah's machine kept crawling. At 4 in the morning, they reached the cattle barn. The animals were restless. Their breath filled the air like smoke. Sarah opened the frozen access panel. The water valve was solid with ice. She heated it using a small propane torch. Water finally burst through the pipe. The cattle began drinking. Earl stood silently. Sarah leaned against the farmel. For a moment, the storm disappeared. Then the barn roof made a terrible sound. Sarah looked up. Snow was piling against the western wall. The wind had formed a drift nearly 12 feet high. The barn door could no longer open. If the drift reached the roofline, the pressure could collapse the structure. Sarah looked at the machine. Then she looked at the drift. Earl shook his head. No. Sarah climbed into the tractor. Earl grabbed her arm. That thing has already done enough. Sarah looked at the barn. There are 83 cattle inside. Earl released her. The farmel rolled forward. The machine entered the drift. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the rusted gears began screaming. Sarah held the throttle steady. The auger turned. The curved housing lifted. The snow cracked open. And suddenly, the entire front of the machine disappeared into the wall. Sarah couldn't see. The tractor engine roared beneath her. The machine kept moving. 10 feet. 20. 30. Snow exploded upward. The homemade chute finally caught. A white column shot into the darkness. Earl stepped backward. The rusted machine was throwing snow higher than the barn. Sarah kept driving. Behind her, a path opened. Ahead, the drift kept rising. And then Sarah saw the thing that made her stop. Buried beneath the snow was the roof of another building. The old machine shed. The one her grandfather had demolished 20 years earlier. Sarah stared at the exposed metal. Then she saw something attached to it. A second machine. Something her grandfather had hidden under the snow. And Sarah suddenly understood why he had saved all those rusted tractor parts. The object beneath the snow was an old snow-clearing attachment. Not a finished machine. A prototype. Sarah recognized the frame immediately. Her grandfather had built the first version decades earlier. The machine beside her was not an invention from nowhere. It was a continuation. He had started it. Sarah had finished it. Earl wiped snow from the old frame. You knew. Sarah shook her head. No. She climbed down. The old attachment had a metal plate bolted to the frame. Her grandfather's initials were stamped into it. E.W. Below them was a date. Sarah touched the plate. Her grandfather had apparently faced a winter storm 30 years earlier and discovered the same problem. Modern snow equipment was expensive. Farmers with small tractors needed something slower. Something reparable. Something made from whatever they already had. He had built a prototype, then abandoned it. Not because it failed. Because the winter ended. Sarah looked at the rusted gears she had bought. Every strange piece suddenly had a purpose. The old cultivator frame. The farmel shaft. The threshing machine pulley. The manure spreader gears. The road grader housing. They weren't random. They were pieces of farm history. Sarah had unknowingly rebuilt her grandfather's idea. Outside, the blizzard reached its worst point. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The radio announced that every major road in the county was closed. The county snowplows couldn't reach isolated farms. Walter Crane, the road supervisor, was stranded 3 miles away. Earl tried the radio. Nothing. Then the machine shed door shook. Sarah looked outside. A figure was standing in the snow. Walter. He had walked from the county road. His face was white with frost. He looked at the machine. Then at Sarah. I heard you had something. Sarah pointed to the farmel. Walter walked closer. You built this. Sarah shook her head. My grandfather started it. Walter studied the machine. Then he crouched beside the frame. He saw the old brackets. The reused gears. The PTO arrangement. His expression changed. I remember this. Sarah stared at him. Walter nodded slowly. Your grandfather showed me the first version when I was 29. Why didn't you tell me? I thought it was scrap. Sarah looked at the rust. So did everyone. Walter stood. No. He looked toward the blizzard. Everyone thought it was obsolete. Sarah climbed back onto the tractor. The machine started. This time, the three of them worked together. Sarah drove. Earl cleared obstacles. Walter marked the safest route. The farmel moved through the storm like a slow red animal. The rusted attachment broke the drifts. The old gears turned. The improvised chute threw snow away from the road. By sunrise, the farm access road was open. Not perfectly, not beautifully, but enough for emergency crews to reach 3 neighboring farms. The machine had cleared nearly a mile of packed snow. By noon, photographs of it were circulating around the county. The county commissioner came to see it. So did farmers who had laughed. Nobody laughed now. Walter Crane approached Sarah beside the farmel. I owe you an apology. Sarah looked at him. For what? For assuming old parts couldn't do new work. Sarah glanced at the rusted machine. Old parts remember things. Walter smiled. That sounds like your grandfather. The bank eventually extended Sarah's loan. Not because the storm had made her rich. It hadn't. The storm had done something more important. It had shown the county that Sarah understood her farm. She wasn't trying to become someone else. She wasn't trying to replace everything old. She was learning what still worked. 5 years later, the farm had grown. Sarah planted winter wheat again. She added 30 acres of hay. The cattle herd doubled. The Formel M still ran. The homemade snow machine sat beneath a new roof. Every winter, Sarah inspected it. She replaced belts, greased bearings, checked the old gears. She never painted it. She left the rust visible. Children from neighboring farms eventually came to see it. Sarah would tell them the same thing. Don't throw something away just because you don't understand it. Earl eventually retired. He sold most of his modern equipment. But he kept one machine, the old Formel M. Sarah had convinced him to buy it after he admitted he liked the way it sounded. Walter Crane retired 2 years later. Before leaving the county office, he donated the original 1958 snow prototype to Sarah. She mounted it beside the machine shed. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Because the machine had never really saved the farm by itself. Sarah had. She had simply listened closely enough to what the old machine was trying to tell her. 10 years after the blizzard, another major snowstorm came through Holt County. Sarah was 30 years old. Her daughter stood beside her in the machine shed. The old farmel waited beneath the lights. The rusted gears were still there. The same ones. The same ugly teeth. The same scarred metal. Her daughter pointed at them. Mom, does that thing really work? Sarah smiled. You want to find out? The tractor started on the first crank. The old engine settled into its familiar rhythm. Outside, snow began falling across the fields. Sarah opened the shed door. Cold air entered. Her daughter climbed beside her. Together, they drove into the white. Behind them, the farm lights glowed through the snow. Ahead, the machine began turning. Slowly, patiently, the way it always had. And as morning came, the first sunlight touched the rusted gears, making them shine like new metal. Sarah watched the snow fall across the quiet Nebraska fields. She had once been 17, standing in a scrapyard while grown men laughed at what she wanted. Now she understood what they had missed. The parts had never been worthless. They had only been waiting for someone patient enough to remember what they could do. If your family ever had an old tractor, machine, tool, or piece of farm equipment that everyone thought was useless, tell us about it in the comments. Sometimes the things that look like junk are carrying more history than we realize. And sometimes, when everything modern fails, an old machine still knows exactly what to do. If you enjoyed Sarah's story, stay with us for the next one. Somewhere on another forgotten farm, another young farmer is about to discover that something everyone else threw away may be the one thing her family needs.